Hello friends, I welcome you to MA Final Paper 8B Women's Writing as a part of MA in English program in Government Dungar College, which comes under Maharaja Ganga Singh University. In this lecture, I will introduce women's writing to you. So first of all, we need to understand that why there arose a need to define women's writing as separate from the common canon of writing. With those of you who are familiar with different forms of literature, you might till now might have realized that women's writing does not form a big part of the mainstream writing that comes in front of us. There might be many reasons. There are critics who have come up with all kinds of things, particularly the marginalization of women and how women up to 19th century, even in 20th century, they were treated as unequals. And even if we go a little further back, you might realize that they were considered incapable of certain things. Education was one of them. And men, almost all over the world, including America, till say the beginning of 20th century, held the opinion that women had no place in the outside world and they belonged to the kitchen. And in some developing, underdeveloped countries, there are still people who hold the same kind of belief. However, women themselves have never been silent. Although they have been cornered, although their writing, their expressions have been crushed, have been put aside, have been glossed over, and yet there has been no age in which women have not come forward in uh, in their stand against the patriarchy dominated society. And they have sounded their concerns through songs, through poems, through novels. Therefore, in the 20th century, there was an increasing need that at least some efforts must be made so that an entire tradition of women's writing, which till then was very sporadic and was not available to many, should come out so that from the beginning to the present, they can form a kind of history of women's writing. And by familiarizing the students or the scholars or the general readers with that tradition, the tradition can be taken further. So, in this is just an introductory lecture, and in this, I will try to briefly sum up what women's writing is all about. To introduce you to the idea of women's writing in general, I have used this article, The History and Importance of Women's Literature by Adrian Rivera. Women's literature has often been defined by publishers as a category of writing done by women. Though obviously this is true, many scholars find such a definition reductive. What makes the history of women's writing so interesting is that, in many ways, it is a new area of study. Now, let me explain this. Why is it that some scholars find this definition a little reductive? The reason being that through ages there have been men who have been very sensitive towards the issues of women, and they have written many women centric novels, poems, and if we were not told that the writer is a male, it would be difficult for us to assess that that particular work has not been written by a woman. So, what these critics or scholars tend to advocate is that the area of writing, women's writing, should not only be limited to women, but it can be expanded to those men who have written women centric literature. Anyways, to a large extent, still women's writing remain limited to works that have come forth from women. The tradition of women writing has been ignored due to the inferior position women, as I told you, position of women have held in male dominated societies. It is still not unheard of to see literature classes or anthologies in which women are greatly outnumbered by male writers or even entirely absent. And this is quite true. This is quite true in the sense that if you come across, if you randomly pick an anthology in a library uh, regarding literature or anything else, you'll find, if you go by the numbers, you'll find that the entries under the names of women, they are seriously limited. The onus of women's literature then is to categorize and create an area of study for a group of people marginalized by history and to explore through their writing their lives as they were while occupying such a unique socio-political space within their culture. Now, what Adrian Rivera means by this is that although you might not find big explanations or a big presence of women as far as literature or other things are concerned. But it does not mean that the women were not there. They were there. They had their own struggles. They were fighting. Sometimes they were heard, sometimes they were unheard or completely ignored. So all those silences, they form a part of women's literature. Now, the effort of women's writing or women's literature or the history of women's writing is to come up with those voices that have been silenced over the ages so that the missing links may emerge regarding what kinds of role women have played so far. Before the introduction of women's literary history, colleges into academia, and the renewed efforts of scholars to explore, recover, and preserve the literary tradition, women themselves were often the only champions of themselves, their contemporaries, and their predecessors. It's interesting to note that women had to speak for themselves as there were not many men who were keen to do so. However, there was a shift with the publication of Mary Wollstonecraft's A Vindication of the Rights of Women in 1792. It is a landmark treatise that paved the way for many women after her to not only publish their works but also to engage in the overall critical discourse surrounding the issue of women in literature. And occasionally, now gradually changes started coming. Occasionally, there were men who spoke alongside women. Some of the first recorded attempts to note women's contribution to literature were catalogues published in the 18th century and were written by men. Feminead 1754 by John Duncombe and Memoirs of Several Ladies of Great Britain who have been celebrated for their writing or skill in the Learned Languages, Arts and Sciences, 1752, by George Ballard, are two such manuscripts. Although it was just the beginning, but dear students, try and understand this thing that it was simply the resilience of women that made it happen. Although it took time, yet their voice was heard, and men could see that they could no longer go on ignoring the presence of women, not only in literature, arts, but in every other area of life.